delighted today to introduce Vijayendra, who is the lead economist at the Development Research Group at the World Bank. And Bijou, as everyone calls him, including you all now, got his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania and taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Michigan and Williams before going to the World Bank. He's made a career of somewhat interdisciplinary research. With his colleague, Paramita Sanyal, Bijou has been documenting and analyzing one of the most important participatory experiments in the world today, I believe, the 1992 decentralization in India of certain powers to the Gram Panchayats, or the village councils, and the institution of the Gram Sabhas, or public meetings, that are held by these Gram Panchayats, theoretically, at regular intervals to discuss some of the important decisions of the village councils. And in this work, Bijou Rao combines deliberative democratic theory with a beautifully planned comparative sample and highly insightful qualitative analysis. Now, as you know, the Ash Institute democracy seminars this year have three themes. One theme is democratic strands and authoritarian regimes, and another is democracy and immigration, and the third is innovations in democratic participation. So we've invited Bijou to speak under this last theme of innovations in democratic participation. And I actually think that deliberative innovation all over the world can learn from the analysis that Bijou Rao and his partners, colleagues have done and are doing on the Indian Gram Sabhas. So please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy School and to the ASH seminar.
Thanks, Jenny. It's an honor to come and speak here, and thanks, Jenny and Archon, for inviting me, and Bruce for arranging things. I should say that Paramita is sitting right here, so any tough questions will be directed to her.
All the blame.
All the blame, all the bad stuff.
That's what sociologists do.
So, I think I think I have about 40 minutes to speak, and I tend to speak very fast. So please stop me if I speak in a way that you can't understand.
You should start English is not the native language of everybody here, so we should keep that in mind.
Okay,
It's hard for you.
I'm still learning.
Yes. Now, as Jenny sort of said briefly, this particular paper is about what is probably, and I think people in this room will know better than I, but I think it's the largest regularly scheduled deliberative institution in the world, in human history, actually. 2 million villages in India have deliberative spaces that meet at least once a year, but more regularly 2 to 4 times a year. The problem is, I'll go into that in a second. And it affects the lives of 700 million people. Okay? So let me get to the history of this in a second, because I think it's kind of interesting. But the overall theme of this is to sort of ask the following question, which is, what is the relationship between culture and poverty, and culture and democracy, in very unequal poor settings? Right? That's the theme of this paper. And here, what we mean by culture is, is not stuff that's embedded somewhere and something that's given exogenously and doesn't change, but as a structure of communication, as a structure of discourse, as something that orders discourse and orders human relationality. So culture ultimately is about human relationality and all the various things that connect human beings to one another. But is obviously structured in ways that are very socially embedded. So it's unequal in places that are unequal, and this is probably as unequal a place as you're going to get. You're talking about a context to rural South India, which retains a very strong presence of the Indian caste system that has seen a fair amount of flux in recent years, but remains very highly correlated with economic inequality and with political inequality, and of course with social inequality. And it remains, whatever mobilities occurred in it, has still kept it very strongly endogamous. So people marry within subcastes, and that of course affects the durability of the economic system. So when we think of culture, then the question is, we're thinking of culture, to use Anne Spindler's work, sort of the toolkits that culture provides that allows people to start negotiating and renegotiating how they relate to one another in communicative ways. So to go back to Amartya Sen's work, thinking of culture as a capability, okay, and that's what the paper's about. Culture as a capability, culture as something that allows people to achieve agency, or not achieve agency. So, I can come back and we can talk about that in the discussion section, but let me just get to the heart of the empirics now. And let me start by giving a little bit of history to the Gram Panchayat system. It's a very, very interesting history, one that I've quite honestly only recently begun to understand, and every time I kind of discover something else and it changes my view of it. So the way I started out with this stuff, as many, many Indians do, we all thought this started from Gandhi, and Gandhian ideas, and he came and sort of brought village democracy to all of India, and we all took it up. And you go and read up on this stuff, it's in fact goes back to 1882. And Gandhi was born in 1869, as you might know. 1882, Lord Ripon in England is a radical politician who is not very liked by the politicians of the time in England, so sent to India as a viceroy to get him out of the system. It's like, let's make him viceroy to India so he doesn't create trouble in England. Now, so send him off there. Ripon is a great follower of John Stuart Mill and a great reader of Henry Maine. And he comes in, and in England is and a great believer in the educative value of local democracy. That's where Ripon is coming from. I mean, Mill famously said that if you want to understand, you want to sort of inculcate the spirit of constitutional democracy, you start at the local level. And really, he takes on that idea and builds on that idea to work on British local government systems at that time, and brings those ideas down to India. In 1882, he, as Viceroy, starts sort of gets this act into place, which is an act of local government in India, sets India's first village and municipal governments. So it's basically an experiment bringing in with Mill. I mean, he's bringing Mill into rural India. That's what he's doing. And 1882. So it goes back to the mainstream of Western political philosophy. It's very interesting to me. There's another interesting story here, which should be kept in mind. Henry Maine, of course, Mill is reading Henry Maine, and Henry Maine, for those of you who may not know, was part of the legal advisory committee, as it were, or something. I don't know what the exact word was, to the British government in India, but was also a major political philosopher, and he wrote this wonderful book on village communities, where he was getting his data, reading transcripts and descriptions by Indian colonial administrators of the way village governments were working in India. And they were uncovering all these deliberative systems that go back to the 7th century, right? And go back to the 7th century, go back to the Mughal era, and they were writing about this stuff and finding these things in Indian villages. And so Maine took this and sort of came up with this wonderful idea of the glorious community, which we all know that is attributed to him. And if you read the book, which is now on Google Books, by the way, it's all free. So I was able to get. It's impossible to get. A World Bank Library doesn't keep these things, So this is what I have to do. But you start reading this stuff, and you start understanding this man, was really building on Indian data. Okay, he's building on Indian data. And Karuna Mantena was a political philosopher at Yale, has been writing about the relationship between Maine and Gandhi. Gandhi read Maine. Gandhi's ideas on village self-reliance, village democracy came from Maine, okay? And he came from Maine trying to rediscover the real India. He said that the real India lies in its villages. This comes from Maine. I mean, and of course he takes it forward and makes it part of the Indian nationalist movement. And by the time independence comes around, village panchayats are part of the nationalist discourse. I mean, some of us who grew up in India, were educated in India, get teary-eyed when you hear about panchayats. Panchayats, oh my God, it's like the American flag for some people here. So this is why I got interested in it. Somebody sort of said panchayat. Wow, wonderful! I'm going to work on this stuff. And the point is that this is all very closely tied in to British political philosophy and to British political philosophers interacting with indigenous thought in India. And of course, there are many other sort of thinkers in India thinking about these things at the same time. There is R.C. Dutt in Bengal. There are many others, and that's a whole different story. But that intersection creates a whole movement, makes village panchayats, empowering village governments in India, part of the nationalist discourse. So when these guys come into power, there's a big battle going on between Nehru and Gandhi. about what to do, how to take India forward, and Nehru being this big big socialist guy, Gandhi being this big village guy, and then Gandhi dies. He gets assassinated in 48, and Nehru's vision gets taken forward. But they're strong Gandhians. I mean, my great friend of mine is a chap called Granville Austin, who is the authority on the making of the Indian Constitution. And he says, and he's now 84 years old, but he says that there was a huge battle going on in how the Constitution was written in 1950. Between 48 and 50, about what role the village government should play. And in fact, the Nehruvians ultimately won. So the Article 40 of the original Indian Constitution was a very, very weak article giving village governments verbal power but no teeth. Yeah? Now, what then happens is that all of this stuff is percolating. There are all these Gandhians, the pseudo-Gandhians or neo-Gandhians running around India all the time, screaming about village government. There's a lot of political resistance to this idea. How can we let those villagers make decisions? They don't know what the hell they're doing. And of course, the administrators to this day remain extremely opposed to the idea of village democracy. But 1992, glory be to heaven, there is a constitutional amendment passed, the 73rd Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which brings village democracy finally into the heart of the Constitution. It does several things. It institutes regular elections every 6 years, supervised by Indian Independent State Electoral Commission, like the one in Afghanistan. You have regularly certified elections, very legitimate elections taking place.
For the local councils.
For the village councils, yes.
Not federal, but for the local councils.
The federal democracy has been around,
right.
for a very long time. We're just talking about village democracy now, finally coming in 93. Regular elections, along with a strong system of political reservations to make sure that women get a voice, they get a seat at the table. So 1/3 of all seats in the council, 1/3 of all presidencies are given to women.
Quotas.
Quotas, yeah, for women and also for underprivileged castes. So all this is great stuff. But what is important for this paper is that there is the institution of the Gram Sabha, the deliberative space is instituted, and it says that these Gram Sabhas shall be empowered to make important decisions for the village. And then what those important decisions are up to the state governments to sort of, in their acts that follow the constitutional amendment, to ratify. But typically they do the following things. So in 1993, I mean, I can go on, maybe just stop on the history there, but it starts then percolating all over India, and states have passed laws to hold Gram Sabhas either between 2 to 4 times a year, depending on the state. These are public village meetings. Anybody can come to them. You can speak about anything you want, but a major goal is to select beneficiaries for anti-poverty programs. A lot of anti-poverty programs in rural India are administered by the panchayat system. The selection of beneficiaries is by the panchayat system. So one interesting, and that's very much part of our paper, is that this selection of beneficiaries happens via a mix of sort of what you might call Cartesian and deliberative systems. So you have a poverty line that's defined by the state government on the basis of some sort of quote-unquote objective criteria. A survey is conducted in each village, and people who fall below a certain score are given what are called below poverty line. And that is abbreviated as BPL, which is now an Indian word in every Indian language. Everybody knows whether they're BPL or not, and they get very upset when they're not BPL. You're either APL, above poverty line, or BPL. So everybody's kind of, and what then happens is, and this is what's so interesting, is that these Cartesian categories are then made fuzzy inside the Gram Sabha. Because you throw this out into the Gram Sabha and everybody starts debating about whether this guy should be in the line or not. And we talk about some of this stuff here. Okay, that's a big part of the role. Second part of the role is to allocate public goods. They have certain grants to sort of pave roads and dig wells and create dams and so on. And the allocation of these public goods are given to the Gram Sabha. So the Gram Sabhas have teeth. They have constitutional authority. They're constitutionally mandated, so that they're on a regular basis. And people attend them. Of course, not the attendance isn't exemplary, but it's more likely to be attended by those who are going to benefit from these public programs more than others. Okay, so that's the background of the Gram Sabha. Coming into what we start observing in what goes on in these spaces.
Grab a chair, Ran, for you.
I mean, that is my chair, which I'm not
No. You might need to sit down. There's plenty of chairs outside.
Did you say the states can decide which? If there's so much resistance among the bureaucracy to this sort of thing,
Can you
one
get a
suspects
chair
some of the
from
states are very restrictive about which specific powers they allocate.
Absolutely. So that's very true. That there's a lot of variation between states about how much power is given to these spaces and how much the state governments facilitate these spaces. In fact, that's our next research piece is going to be understanding how that actually works. But you're quite right about that. Yeah. So there's a lot of variation across different states and how these actually
So the
work.
talk today is going to be about one or two specific states.
No, the talk today. So. So what we've done and what I've been doing for some time from 2004 to 2006 is that I've in the four South Indian states, which are Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu, using a particular sampling design I'm happy to go into later. I have been tape recording these Gram Sabhas on top of various other surveys we've been doing in these places. And we have, up to this point, we've got about 290 Gram Sabhas that we've recorded in the four South Indian languages. They've been recorded, transcribed, and then translated into English for analysis. Yeah? And it's kind of interesting because each translation was done within state. So if you know any, I mean, I don't know how much, if you know India, you have a distinct sort of state language flavor to each of these translations. So it sort of gives you a certain authenticity. So and that shows up in some of the quotes we will give you today. And I will try to put on accents that are appropriate. We're going to be looking at two. I mean, so there's some interesting things to keep in mind. I'll summarize this at the end. Firstly, you have this creation of a public sphere, but this is a public sphere that's been created by the state. So there's a real blurring of civil society in the state here. I mean, this is kind of interesting. And it's actually an intervention that has created the public sphere. Okay, this is an act, and it has implications for life in general. Powers that be dislike this space because what they're doing is they're making hidden transcripts public. I mean, you stuff that was secret, and people were, people were saying things about how they were oppressed in private are now publicly expressed, which is threatening, and they actually start making demands and start shedding light on stuff. The transparency, accountability, all that good stuff starts happening in these spaces when they work well. And that's very threatening, obviously, to the powers that be, so try to suppress them. Data that we collected in 2002 showed that at that time, only about half the villages had ever had more than one meeting in the year. I mean, they were supposed to have at least two, had more than one meeting during the year. So, but that sort of has been changing rapidly. By the time we collected these data, the various governments had been told to sort of make sure that these spaces are activated, and they're much better off now. Okay, we're going to be doing sort of two things here. What the paper's about and what the talk will be about is trying to sort of show two ways in which civic agency is inculcated in these spaces, in which sort of communicative, the styles of communication, discursive communication, is affected in these spaces. One is to understand how inequality and poverty shape the nature of discourse, right? So I'll be sort of trying to highlight that at one level. And the second part of it is the opposite side of that, if you wish, is how these spaces are shaping the meaning of poverty, the intersubjective understanding of poverty, okay? So poverty is not something given. I mean, in the World Bank, I work in the poverty group of the research department of the World Bank. My colleagues are obsessed with the measurement of poverty. In fact, my colleagues tell you how many poor people there are in the world. The $1 a day came from my boss, right? So this is the guys I work with, and I love dearly. The problem is, of course, that poverty is not a number. I mean, and it's not just a PPP, kind of is the $1 a day the appropriate metric? It has meaning for people, and has different meanings for different people, and that's what we start unpacking here as well, and what the space allows you to allows an unpacking of, which is kind of very interesting, I think. Yeah. So let me first start by the other thing to keep in mind is to sort of hear this as not. I mean, think of the classic standard sort of ideas of deliberation that one reads about in political philosophy, and you'll see here that this is a really highly competitive space. This is not some sort of reason giving. Let's listen and let's learn. Even Jenny didn't find that in Vermont, but I keep sort of saying that that's how Vermont works. But this business of a New England style sort of deliberative system where you listen and you learn and you sort of come to a consensus at the end ain't what's going on here. These are South Indians. They are argumentative, as Sen called them. They are like me. They are not always very polite people and not very good listeners. And what you have essentially is a discursive system that's embedded within an idea of citizenship that is not necessarily about rights and responsibilities, but about a gift economy. Okay? The state provides benefits. These guys are asking for benefits. And it is an exchange that boils into electoral politics all the time. You take care of me, I will vote for you. I mean, it happens in every democracy in the world, but it's very explicit in Indian democracy. Yeah? So it's really a gift economy. You've got to think of this as a potluck, right? And these guys are arguing within this potluck. So it's really, instead of, more than a deliberative space, it's more like a courtroom.
Did you say potluck or potlatch?
Potlatch,
Okay,
right?
potlatch, right.
You do get biscuits and tea when they're nice to you. So there's maybe an element of the potluck as well. But potlatch, yeah. So it's very much a competitive space trying to seek benefits, and people compete with each other on this particular space. So having said that, let me just give you now a few examples of the first thing of how poverty and inequality shape deliberation and discursive styles. So we begin with a relatively long excerpt from a Gram Sabha that had only 8 people in it. Okay, people didn't attend this very much. There's 8 people attended, but those 8 people are kind of interesting players. There is the chap called who's, I mean, this is an official title in India, by the way. It's called the President Husband. What this basically means is that the seat for the presidency is 1/3 of all presidency reserved for women. The woman, obviously, in many cases, is not actually doing much, and it is a husband who's doing all the management and having all the power. So instead of being called the president, he's the president husband. And in fact, they call themselves president, but he says, no, I'm president husband, but actually president. See this again and again and again. And there's a big controversy, a big debate going on about what the impact of women's reservations is and all that, which a lot of it has been conducted in this town and in other places. We're happy to talk about that later. But there's a president husband here. There is a chap from a relatively high caste, the chap from a scheduled caste, very briefly, let me just explain what this is. The scheduled caste groups are the formerly untouchable groups, the most discriminated groups in Indian society, who've been benefited from 50 years of affirmative action, 60 years of affirmative action programs, including political reservations in these spaces. And a lot of what we're observing is their discursive empowerment. Right? So let's start with that particular narrative. So here's a relatively upper class male villager called Jairam, and he says, there are 45 families in our village. None of us have any land. We work for meager daily wages. Whatever little we get, we spend on our children's education. But it's impossible to educate our children up to high school because we don't have the money. So we request the government to do something. Our whole area is dirty. Even the water is muddy, and that's what we drink. How many times we have requested for a road near the cremation ground and for the supply of clean water? We can only request and apply. The rest is up to you. Gift economy of the state. Yeah? The president husband replies, Jenny, can you tell me when I have about 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay. President husband responds, if there are 20-25 houses in an area, a ward member should be appointed to represent the area. That ward member should listen to your problems and must do something to help you. Basically saying, talk to your representative. Then the scheduled caste guy, I'm going to, the right term for scheduled caste is Dalit, because that's the social movement terms. That's what I'm going to use from now on. The Dalit member, Muniraj, says, that way, if they have a ward member, we will have the guts to enter the room where the Gram Sabha meeting is taking place. If the required ward members are not with us, to whom can we voice our woes? Who will represent me? If the ward member belongs to another community, he won't even listen to our problems. Earlier, there was a time when a backward caste person was not even allowed to sit in the same area with others. The officers and leaders who came here to the Gram Sabha meeting already had a preset plan about what to do and say. You come here, sit on the chair, say something, decide amongst yourselves, and go away. What is there for us to do? You've enjoyed power for all these years. Why didn't you let us have a turn? We don't want any problem at the communal level. For us, whoever comes, it's the same. We vote, but what happens later? Whereas other people get water even before they ask for it, we have to ask endlessly. And even so, our demand is not fulfilled. We don't want to fight with anyone, but at least we should be someone to listen to our problems. We've been without water supply for 1 month. Even the president knows that he has promised to send water, but the ward member is not allowing us to take water. The water is sent to all of his relatives. They cannot do anything to stop it. So notice again, this gift economy sort of discourse taking place, but the guy is the Dalit. And he's essentially putting on the table out there, you guys screwed us for so many years. Now listen to us, because democracy has allowed us, has forced you to listen to us, right? He's putting that on the table. Okay. President husband replies, in any competition, it's a rule that one should win and the other should lose. There is no community-based discrimination or problem. If all of you in booth number 1, the booth is a voting booth, join and vote for me, I become the president. On the other hand, his wife did, but anyway. On the other hand, if everyone in the other booths vote for another person, then he'll become the president. And then what will matter if he can do, then what will matter is what he can do for those booths that voted for him. Today amongst youngsters, there's a level of public awareness is very high. Anyone can become a leader. Even though there are problems between the two groups, I try to mediate. I don't try to encourage communal riots. Okay? So he started throwing back electoral democracy at him. Yes? Muniraj says, the Dalit guy, everyone should be treated equally. No one should be treated as inferior to others. We should also be given a right to sit on the dais where the leaders sit. Why should we be denied that right? Just because I talk like this, it does not mean I fight with you or disrespect you. I am simply voicing my feeling. He wants, this is civic agency. Okay? He's saying, I can say these things now in this space, and you've got to listen to me. And why does he have to listen to him? Because we live now in a village democracy. And if you don't listen to him, that vote bank is not going to vote for you. Right? And that is what makes this an equal discursive space. At that moment when this meeting takes place, caste politics are explicitly expressed, equality, there's discursive equality takes place, hidden transcripts become public because you're fighting ultimately in an electoral space. And that's what gives these places a certain level of discursive equality. Okay, let's move to another example, which is kind of another example of how this whole thing works. We're talking here about sort of discursive spaces and discursive civic agency, but it's not just talk. It's not just talk, because here's an example of a guy who is a Dalit guy in another village in another state where there is a serious water problem. It just so happens those of you who don't know about Indian villages, they tend to be very segregated. They are very segregated. The Dalits all live in one part of the village. Tends to be the most downstream parts. It gets, during monsoons, it gets very flooded and swamped. And the upper caste live in a separate part of the village. So it just so happens that the Dalit well has water. So he says, in our Dalit colony, there is a bore well that's flush with water. If a tank is constructed, this water can be useful for the entire village. The village is saying there's no water, there's a drought, there's no water anywhere. They say, come to my well and drink from my water, knowing full well that they won't dare do that because it's dirty water to them. Okay, and he's basically pushing that space.
It's dirty water because it's not because it's downstream, but because it's Dalit water.
It's Dalit water, yes.
Okay.
And he knows that, and he's saying, okay, man, guys, let me put it out there. So, and this you would never see this kind of thing happening. You would never see this kind of thing happening. That's what this space is activating. Yeah. But again, you see how these social relationships are being. So one way of thinking about it are these sort of these cultural endowments, if you want to call it that, a form of capital. They allow a certain set of tools to now be used that could never be used before. You can use these sort of manipulative mechanisms using where you are and who you are because of political space, because you now have political power to manipulate how that space discurses. Another example is of course you say these things and it's not that the upper caste don't react, okay? And you have here an example of an upper caste guy reacting to these sorts of uppity guys coming in and sort of making their mark in these spaces, and he's trying to assert his authority. So here you have a Brahmin villager in another village. There's a discussion going about where to locate public goods and what to do with these public goods allocations, and he says, we need cemented roads in the Brahmin street. We don't care about the expenses incurred by the panchayat. Our problem must be addressed. Okay, the secretary, who is the chief administrative officer of the village, says, the panchayat does not have any money. If you want this project, you have to come forward with your voluntary contributions. The Brahmin guy replies, we don't care in the least about other development activities. First of all, we need cement roads. That's it. The point is, these are empty words because nobody's going to listen to this guy. It's like a last spurt of something that he has to sort of express in this space. He's politically been disempowered, effectively, because nobody listens to him. Doesn't have the political authority or the economic authority or the social authority or, for that matter, the moral authority to make these sorts of claims. But in this space, they can make himself heard. Okay, so you have this sort of discursive competition. Sorry,
symbolism.
It's symbolism. It's a way of sort of just saying, I used to be someone. Yeah? So the reverse of Martin Brando here. Now, what sort of also happens here is that, remember that as in this country, affirmative action, it's not at all true that everybody who benefits from affirmative action because they belong to a certain category of caste is necessarily poor. And that has caused a fair amount of debate and resentment amongst relatively upper caste folks who are poor, right? Now, there's a lot of talk about this in the press and other places, but here you have it being expressed in the Gram Sabha. Here's a guy who's not upper caste but higher than the Dalit caste, who says, there are Harijan people here. Harijan is Gandhi's word for Dalits. There are Harijan people here who don't have homes. They work as coolies, and coolies are day laborers, along with other people who are not Dalits, who also have no other option but to work as coolies. However, whereas all the Harijans get their dues and facilities, the others who do the same job do not get the same reward as his fellow worker. The government does not give any sort of concessions to these poor coolies, where the Harijans get all the sorts of concessions from the government. This debate in affirmative action, on affirmative action, the Gram Sabha has no authority over this. It's like the lowest rung of government. It's sort of, this comes 20 levels above. But here you have this debate going on whether it's fair or not. See, the idea of fairness, the idea of what is a fair allocation mechanism, the idea of affirmative action, the fairness of unfairness of it is now occurring within these spaces. What you're finding is these things that were parts of maybe happening in people's homes are now happening in a public space. You have, there's no question to me that this is a public sphere. This is the development of a public sphere that is then, if we take Jenny's ideas sort of into it, will result in some form of sort of a change in everyday talk, and then get percolate in some further way. And we'll be doing some further research trying to see whether that happens, that I'm happy to talk about. Another example. Veluswamy, who's an upper caste villager, says, I've been residing this village through several generations and have been asking for a house to live in. They say today, tomorrow, but so far nothing has been done. I'm sitting here at the mercy of my fate. And the GP secretary says, till now, houses have been allocated only for Dalits. It hasn't come for your caste. Veluswamy says, and think of Shylock and Merchant of Venice. Okay? They say that it has come only for the Dalits. Only for them. Is it that only they are humans? Are we people not humans too? How can you say that such a thing? What kind of panchayat is this? We can't go directly and meet the officer. We can only make kind requests to our president, whom we believe in. Please make some arrangements for us. Okay? So again, this is, so Indian, I don't know, if you ever encountered a Indian joint family, I mean, it's like, I suppose, like Jews and Italians or whoever else, whatever other stereotype you want to come up with. There's a lot of manipulation. There's a lot of verbal manipulation. There's a lot of sort of, using words to make you feel bad so you'll get something from there. Okay? So he's using those techniques. Sort of saying, feel bad. Take care of me too. So the interesting how discursive styles move from the social sphere into the public sphere. Another example of that, of the intersections in private and the public spheres, is of a woman who is, what we're finding very much of these data is that, particularly in low literacy places, people are constantly sort of making private demands in the public space, not knowing that you cannot get very private demands in the context of village governments. But the clever ones try to express their, as happened in Vermont, try to use express their private demands in public language, right? So try to make it politically acceptable. So this is an example of that. But let me give you, so Dalit woman this time says, you must lay a road for our street. It's very difficult for the children to walk, you must help us. President says, your street is not at all a busy street. Your husband is ill and disabled, making it difficult for him to walk. So you have to hold and assist him to walk. We will lay roads if more funds are available. In other words, he knows enough of this woman to know exactly what she's asking for. He recognizes there's sort of a legitimate issue for her, but it's sort of saying, look, is this a public good? I mean, is it necessarily that this is a private demand? So the woman says, I don't have another woman actually this time says, I don't have a husband and I'm suffering a lot with a child and haven't been able to pay my house rent for the past 6 months. I want a house. President replies, you've moved away from your husband of your own accord after fighting with him. We'll give you a house if the grant comes. So in other words, because this is an intimate public space, the guy knows everything but everybody, and he's kind of mixing up all this private gossip into making allocation decisions, yeah? And so this is village democracy. I mean, and it's I think it's kind of interesting. Now, so what you find in these spaces is wait a minute, just to summarize this very briefly. How much time do I have?
Oh, I forgot. But we still got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, fine. So what you're finding in these spaces is basically these, the intersection of the public and the private, as you often see in public sort of discursive spaces, a sort of empowerment and a change in the toolkit of how formerly disadvantaged groups can make discursive arguments. A recognition that you can't really put people down by simply sort of asserting that you are from an upper caste. But then you have, of course, upper caste bemoaning their fate and trying to make their presence heard by shouting loudly, but not being very effective. You also find people talking about general issues that have nothing to do with the panchayat, just a way of sort of talking about stuff that has to do with Indian democracy, and is not directly relevant to the decisions made by the panchayat, but is relevant to a change in civic discourse. Yeah. So from there, what we're going to do next is to move to this idea of the fuzziness of the poverty line, of how Cartesian categories are made fuzzy, and how deliberation shapes the meaning of poverty. Okay, so what really is happening here is that the state government, as I said, is giving these categories. The categories have been deliberated and discussed. So what you have is a joint understanding, a joint production of what poverty means. It's an intersubjective understanding of poverty. And I think that's something that at least economists haven't begun to appreciate. Okay? That poverty now in all of India is not simply a matter of a line. People's understanding of poverty is very sophisticated because of spaces like this. Right? And these lines are being debated and thrashed around and being sort of torn apart in these spaces all the time. So let's start with an example of a ward member, a village council member, who's trying to explain what this BPL means. And he sort of says, how to check BPL households' financial status. We cannot check this as accurately as doing a mathematics sum. Now, what is the definition of a family? Generally includes a husband, wife, and 2 children. If the family does not eat posh food every day but has ganji, which is rice gruel, for breakfast, then they spend about 25-30 rupees. Some people have unnecessary habits like drinking tea. Taking all of this together, a family of 4 needs at least 60-70 rupees per day. If they spend only 50 rupees per day, even then it comes to more than 12,000 rupees a year. This is the guideline that we've been trying to give to the poverty status. We also have details of those households who have telephone connections or mobile phones. These people cannot be considered BPL. Actually, that's a state law. That if you have a mobile phone, which everybody does now, you cannot get a BPL allocation. Which is crazy because what you have, famously, it happens to everybody does a survey in India. You go and ask somebody, do you have a mobile phone? No. What's that phone there? Whose phone is ringing over there? Not mine. It happens all the time. Okay, so another GB president saying, now marks are allocated to each applicant, scores allocated to each applicant. Previously, when Vasu and Chaklo, Chetan were presidents, previous guys, we used to give benefits according to our wish. We knew who the poor were and we used to give them the benefits. But now the government has made some rules and regulations based on which marks are allocated to which applicants. It's not like school teachers giving extra marks to children that they like. Here there are rules. And only based on that, marks are allocated to each benefit. If you have any doubts of the marks allocated to you and others, then we can certainly checking out. It's actually putting out this score to public debate. Okay. So ward member says, there are many defects in selecting beneficiaries. Usually we give houses and toilets to people who have land. If we select a person who doesn't have land, then we can't give them a home. Even if people say that they'll own land after the partition man says that land is still not possible. Only if you own land now, you cannot be granted a house. And this is a bit of a problem. He's sort of making this point clear, which is the Gram Panchayat is empowered to give houses to Dalit folks. Okay? It gives houses, but doesn't have the authority to give land. So the whole question becomes, it's a catch-22. You don't have land, so I can't give you a house, but I can't give you land, so I can't give you this benefit. And that's what he's putting up. He's sort of saying this is a problem. Okay? And so they're unpacking the bureaucratic categories. You have other stuff going on. You have people, villagers, questioning the categories themselves. Here's an example of that. The villager was a low caste guy, but not a Dalit guy, says, our calculation is correct. The village people took that census, but the census taken by so there's a village census that was taken place and the government census. It says the government census was not done properly. It differs. The ward member should look into it and add the beneficiaries. By the way, I've been to about 50 Gram Sabhas in my life. You find this happening all the time. You find this happening all the time. It sort of gets boring. You constantly see this happening. People questioning the categories, the fairness of the categories themselves, asking whether this is the right category, and then of course saying that that guy's on the list, but he shouldn't be there. Now, of course, what happens, you have all this discussion in the Gram Sabha. Later on, they can always be undermined. So, but the point is that the public nature of that discussion makes people aware of what the political calculations are. So that guy was actually not allocated the benefit, but suddenly got the benefits later on. They know there's some sort of funny stuff going on, and that can then be exposed. But how it gets exposed, whether it gets exposed, is another story. So another example. This Palani, some chap, is rich, but he's been added on the BPL list. How is this possible? The BPL list is wrong. You find this happening all the time. Okay? So, there's several other examples of this in the paper, which I don't have time to get into, and much more on the data. But let me sort of try to summarize what the paper has tried to do so far. And instead of speaking extempore, I'm just going to read it out. So the paper highlights a relatively neglected aspect of the relationship between culture and poverty, of culture as a relational discursive process which is both affected by economic, social, and political inequalities, and which in turn influences them. If pro-poor policy is largely driven by the goal of equality of opportunity, we argue that this needs to be supplemented by the goal of equality of agency through processes that give voice and agency to the poor. Indeed, cultural processes can be shaped by public action to ameliorate poverty and inequality. The focus of our paper is an important constitutional amendment in India that attempted precisely such a transformation by instituting deliberative forums called Gram Sabhas in all 2 million Indian villages. They are empowered to make important decisions in the selection of public goods and beneficiaries for anti-poverty programs within the context of durable inequalities of caste, gender, religion. These public fora, which can be thought of as a state-engineered public sphere, provide a deliberative space where the boundary between state and civil society is blurred. The Gram Sabha is hardly a place where participants engage in rational negotiation to reach a consensus with sort of single-peak preferences. Public deliberation in the Gram Sabha is rather a competition between groups and individuals who want a piece of the public pie and employ a wide repertoire of discursive techniques to make their voices heard. Participants are not interested in reaching a consensus, but rather to seek their particular claims to the gifts of the state. In this climate, few citizens are listening to one another. Each petitioner argues that he or she deserves the most benefit. Each strives to make the decision makers hear and grant their plea. The result is a competition based on caste identity and notions of justice rather than reason. In this way, poverty and social inequality have shaped a vernacular style of competitive discursive negotiation within Gram Sabhas. The competition for state-sponsored public benefits, moreover, takes place in the context of changing national priorities, which express themselves in new amendments to policies designed to correct social and economic inequalities. Federal and state schedules, for instance, are used to target benefits to discriminated castes and quantitative service to identify citizens living below the poverty line. Yet, as Scott argues, the rush to classify, Scott was here last week, yes? Yeah. Argues the rush to classify human populations results in a Cartesian logic that forces unforgiving geometric patterns on categories that are inherently fuzzy. The Gram Sabha allows this fuzziness to be expressed and observed, if not by the high state, far away in the state capital, and at least by the more proximate Gram Sabha. The Gram Sabha also allows those affected by these policies to express a dismay when state categories fail to take into account the realities they face. Okay? As a vehicle for expressing India's understanding of poverty and the state's attempt to address it, the Gram Sabha does not always accord with the proximal interests of the state. It rather creates a new political culture located with the intersections of the state, the village, and the local matrix of embedded social relationships. By providing a space where opinions can be voiced with relative freedom, a relatively temporary level discursive playing field, these local forums also help teach people to engage and debate, and to question decisions and definitions of the government and the Gram Panchayat. In this sense, the Gram Sabha has become an arena where poor low-caste villagers, male and female, participate and seek dignity. This process resembles the nature of high-level democratic institutions in India, which some have argued have been more effective as vehicles for supporting social dignity rather than economic mobility. So, what can India's experience with the Gram Sabha teach us about policies to improve the deliberative capacity of the poor in general? First, it teaches us that rituals such as the Gram Sabha work when they are predictable and regular. Regularity ensures that interactions between people and groups have to accommodate this new space where all citizens, regardless of class, caste, and gender, can voice their opinions publicly in a way that holds the state accountable. If deliberative forums were temporary ad hoc events, then they could be much more easily ignored, manipulated, or rendered ineffective. Second, it shows that participatory forums, in order to provide the right incentive of participation, must have clout, right? And gram sabhas empower to discuss village benefits and select beneficiaries. This makes them worth attending. Third, it indicates that from the perspective of inculcating voice, any policy effort must pay attention to the relation between the deliberative and the electoral space. Gram sabhas are the deliberative space embedded within an electoral space, forcing politicians to allow all groups to speak lest they lose their votes. However, deliberative rituals are potentially contentious. By allowing marginal groups the ability to and the space to voice their concern, they permit hidden transcripts to become public, forcing public discussion on issues that people would rather avoid. They can also shift political power by creating political coalitions between like-minded groups that social norms might have previously prevented from collaborating. All this can disturb the social equilibrium and increase the potential for conflict. And I have observed people getting beaten up in gram sabhas in at least 4 occasions. In some instances, the gram sabhas may also have the ironic effect of making villages less governable by reducing the effectiveness of benevolent local dictators. Okay? So, to summarize, culture therefore is not, as we are told, a primordially fixed, historically endowed explanatory variable that's highly resistant to change. It is a relational, communicative process that can be influenced by public policy in a manner that can result in both psychic and material advantages for the poor. Human relations are inherently stratified, and these stratifications are reinforced by acts of exclusion and discrimination that create adverse terms of recognition for the poor, depriving them of social, political, and cultural capital. If we recognize such non-economic capitals to be as important as human and physical capital in sustaining durable inequality, then it is imperative to acknowledge that equalizing voice and civic and political participation require just as much attention from public policy as improving access to education and employment and health. But processes that equalize voice and agency are necessarily cultural. They are relational and communicative, creating the capacity for the disadvantaged to cross over from being passive recipients of public largesse towards becoming active participants in determining their own destinies. Finding effective mechanisms to give the poor voice and political agency is therefore an important way by which a cultural lens can help inform our public policy. Thanks.